XAnalysts. Empowering analysts, transforming markets.
Rachel, good to connect with you. What a turn of events, what a start of the year. I'm sure you are busy somewhere in the world and keeping a track of the markets. Tell me where you are and tell me what are you reading, what are you thinking about what's happening on the US and the Venezuela side.
Yeah, Mukesh, it's such a pleasure to be with you and to try to unpack these fast-moving developments with you. Today, I'm in Philadelphia. I'm at a big gathering of economists. It happens every year, the first weekend of January.
So, Rachel, you're in Philadelphia. What's your quick take on the evolving situation? Is this done, or will this get this? There is a chance to something spiral out or get messy.
It definitely could get messy. Maduro's out, but we don't know what the new government will look like.
Okay.
And it
what
could
happens
be
on
quite
Monday?
Complicated.
Okay. What happens on Monday? Oil price, market reacts. Which way?
I think it's down a little bit, right? Reverses some of the upside we've seen recently, and there'll be some optimism.
And what's the quick take on, does it make U.S. attempt to resolve Ukraine-Russia crisis any easier or more difficult?
I don't think it makes. I think it's neutral. That what clearly there's a connection, right? Resolving this might undermine the shadow fleet, and that could undermine Russia. And any additional barrels of oil and weaker prices might hurt Russia just as it does other energy producers. But Putin has shown himself pretty impervious to some pressure. So the ball's still in his court, I think.
What happens with Canada? Because Canada and Venezuela produce very heavy crude oil of similar qualities. Now that you have access to Venezuela, US will not care about Canada?
Yeah, well, it's not necessarily great for Canada when the U.S. cares about it, right?
Okay.
But that's another story. Right now we see, Canada's exporting about 4 times as much oil to the U.S. as Venezuela is. That's already a pretty sizable market share. Some of the parts of the U.S. that most rely on Canadian crude, the pipeline structure wouldn't work for them to use to use Venezuelan oil. So I think it's a medium-term challenge, as any additional fuel supply coming online is. But ultimately for Canada, the bigger challenge is outside of the energy sector, and it's also the domestic challenge of building more pipelines to have more optionality in where they can export.
No, you said it right, because US reversed all the pipelines going from the Gulf Coast above to the Mid-Con refineries. You can't just reverse them back again by pumping. So I guess Canada will stay important. China will probably stay very important. So very interesting developing story. US is after the Venezuelan oil. And if the entire proven world reserves of Venezuelan crude goes to the US economy, it can get trillions of dollars of boost. So I know a lot of armchair analysis is happening. So I want to ask you at the beginning, what do you think is the reason other than the oil from a geopolitics angle?
Yeah, so other than the oil, I think Venezuela has been a major source of illicit migration to the US, and that has been a major driver of the Trump administration. Venezuela's, there's a lot of talk about Venezuela as a source of drugs and illicit drug smuggling. There's definitely a lot of that in Central America and even South America, but there's very little evidence in my mind that Venezuela is a major player. But I do think this migration story is an important one for the Trump administration, and that is part and parcel of why Trump administration officials like Marco Rubio have really fixated on these issues. Now, it's also linked to concerns about the persistent dictatorship in Cuba and the dictatorship in Venezuela. I think the energy piece is part of trying to get a bigger coalition to support this, but ultimately, I think this broader question of the US trying to be more active in the hemisphere to reduce China's role in the hemisphere, to kick, if the Iranians and Russians have roles, to kick them out. I mean, Russia's a more complicated case, as we've talked about in the past. Some days the US likes the Russians, some days Trump is mad at Putin. Yeah. It goes back and forth. But there's a variety of factors here. I would say that the oil is one of what Trump sees as a big upside of this regime change.
Okay, one quick one, Rachel. I think this is indeed a very serious topic, which could have escalated such a huge risk, which could have escalated into many directions. I want to show some data points about this whole thing. And then probably I want to ask you about what's so unique this time around, which didn't happen in the past. So let's go through some numbers, Rachel, and I'm showing some charts around. First is the imports of Venezuelan oil into China. China started buying an increased rate from the middle of the last year because they probably knew the change that might come in the US White House. And since mid last year's to now, China has probably imported almost 300 million barrels of Venezuelan oil. This is almost what the US needs to fill the SPR from current 413 to 700 plus and reach its capacity, which I believe the US government said that we want to fill it to the brim. So China has already taken it away.
Yeah,
that's the second one.
Thing, sure. Can I make a comment on that chart? One of the reasons geopolitically why that happened was that the US administration, the Trump administration, canceled licenses that allowed non-Chinese buyers to buy Venezuelan crude. So until the spring of last year, India was buying Venezuelan crude, Brazilians were buying it, Europeans were buying it. And so that also meant that more oil was being sold at global market prices instead of the super discounted prices China can command when it's the only buyer, right? If you're the only supplier, you have leverage, but if you're the only buyer, you can have leverage to set prices. So I think you're completely right. We saw China stepping up purchases of all sanctioned crude starting in the second half of last year, but here it was also, in my mind, a sign of the political pressure and economic pressure that the Trump administration was trying to exert on the Maduro regime, even as far back as April. There were political dynamics where, in order to get some budget bills passed through the US Congress, some representatives from Florida basically said, if you don't put more pressure on Venezuela, we're not going to vote for your budget. And that was one of the dynamics. So you have, I think, a structural story of Chinese role, and then a decision from the Trump administration that it was time to start playing hardball with Venezuela rather than trying to make a deal with Maduro.
It's a very important additional color that on one hand, US didn't allow others to buy, and that became a big win for China at a discounted rate. So my view has been that this is all about a US-China negotiation. If Venezuela was not selling any crude to China at a very high discounts and China was not the beneficiary of it, probably US would not have paid too much attention to Venezuela. So I think the China link is very big. But let me show some more data points. The Venezuelan exports or imports into the rest of the world other than China, they stood somewhere around 2 million barrels in 2016-17s. And of course, with sanctions came to a grinding halt in 2021, less than 200. And then US has been a little bit buyer, but the numbers are below 500. Another important data point, Canada, imports of Canada crude oil to China are skyrocketing at more than 500,000 barrels. And that's what we have seen, the drop in the US imports of the Canadian barrels. Of course, China has been buying lots and lots of Russian barrels, and China has been buying the Iranian barrels. So overall, I feel, Rachel, that 4 million barrels discounted crude China was buying at such a huge discounted rate, and they didn't worry about backwardation or contango. Probably China is the reason the market stays backwardated. I wanted to ask you, when you look at these numbers, any comments? Plus, what's so unique this time around, which did not exist before, a situation or a driver that such a huge military escalatory risk has been taken?
So just to comment first on this, these triangles, or maybe they're interesting fork-shaped structures of the Canada-China relationship. A big thing there was that it wasn't until about a year ago that the TMX pipeline was introduced that allowed more Canadian oil to get to Tidewater to be sold in the Pacific. So it otherwise would have needed to go through the United States and then to China. So it's expensive to get that oil to Tidewater. But there is, this is at a point where in this period of time, the U.S. government started talking about annexing Canada. There are trade disputes between Canada and the U.S., and so I think there is a push from the Canadian side to diversify. Now, that being said, U.S. tariffs don't affect its imports of oil directly, and there's a lot of refineries in the Midwest and the center of the United States that really don't have an option because of the pipeline structure. They kind of have to get the oil from Canada, and they're aligned to do this sort. So there may be some limits there, but ultimately, what we have seen, China likes a bargain, but China also does not want to be too reliant on any one supplier. And these two different competing trends, I think, are there. And you're right, if China wasn't buying Venezuelan crude, the Maduro regime would have fallen years ago, right? They wouldn't have had that lifeline. It's a counterfactual that's interesting to explore. We know that the U.S. administration is worried about Chinese influence in the hemisphere. They don't like Chinese ownership of the ports in Panama. There's a variety of other issues here. I'm not sure that the ends justify the means here. In terms of what's different now versus in the summer, or what's different than a few months ago, some of it is, I think we've seen a buildup over the last several months. First, we saw financial pressure, the new sanctions. Then we started to see these military operations on these boats that were deemed to be exporting drugs. I've not seen evidence that proves that, but maybe we'll take them at their word. And then in the last couple of weeks, we've seen these tanker seizures and the U.S. administration trying to do a blockade. And the early evidence from the last few weeks suggests that Venezuelan exports to any country but the United States actually started to fall. Vessels that were already on their way to China continued on to China, but the vessels couldn't get in to deliver the diluent. The vessels couldn't get out to send to China. So in a way, this seizure of Maduro was the latest step of a stepped up economic pressure. I do think it's been in the works for some time, and some of it is just weather related, of why it happened today, but some of it is just, and I'm not a military strategist, but it can be important to do these efforts under a full moon when there's different natural light. So there are different factors here, but what we have seen since, I would say, the middle of November, right, maybe even since October, is this step up in quasi-military and economic pressure on the Maduro regime, trying to get him out more. And so I see this as being part of that. But there's still an open question about what kind of government will follow Maduro in Venezuela, and that's going to be quite important for the oil market. Quite an
important question. Yeah, indeed. Now, so I think you brought a very important point, Rachel, which is that this is probably U.S. is getting two birds with one stone, kind of. One, taking care of the advantage of China, also taking care of a regime which they wanted to change, possibly. And I also feel that from a geopolitical angle, and a short comment from you, that probably what was done in Iran didn't establish the military firepower or supremacy which US wants to show. And I guess Venezuela was an easy target in this region to demonstrate and display that, so that many other countries might have an impact, an indirect message. So it's an indirect message to many other people and places. And like Greenland, again, I was hearing that there's a talk around that. So we need it for security. So I guess this is a build up towards something more. Now, let me share a few thoughts, and I wanted to ask a question: what happens next? The first thing in my mind is, of course, geopolitically, what happens next, but what happens next to the oil? I see two paths. One path, Rachel, which I'm hearing a dominant narrative, US will put a pipeline kind of and take all the oil, the proven reserves, and fill the SPRs. I have done some extensive analysis, and my read is that SPRs, there are 4 SPRs there. They typically hold about 13 million barrels, and most of about 60 to 70% is kind of the sour and the heavier barrels. That's the barrels US needs. Also, filling the light barrels is a technical challenge. Down the SPRs at around 10 barrels per day rate, you can draw them there fast. But filling the SPRs, I think the technical rates may be near 700 KBD per day, KBD, but the real achieved are probably near 100 to 200. So if US has to fill the SPRs at a near 200 KBD rate, it will take 5 years. SPRs are not designed to be filled fast. They are designed to be drawn out faster. So that's one place where the oil can go. Now, that's a technical challenge for sure. There's another angle which I'm reading that Trump has said that the US administration has said that the oil can still flow to China. Your take on where the oil will flow? Will it come more to the US? Will it stay in Venezuela and nothing much will happen? Will it continue to flow to China? And I think flow to China is probably a more interesting part to get your take on.
Yeah, so I think we don't know yet, and I'm not just dodging because the Trump administration, the U.S. administration's choices on sanctions are very important. China is more resilient to U.S. financial pressure than other countries are. Countries like India, for example, whose banks have more use of dollars, and it's harder to insulate the markets in full. We've seen that even with the reduction in some of the Indian imports of Russian crude oil in recent weeks since the sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil, which we talked about at the time. So there's a choice here. In my mind, going back to the status quo, where the bulk of Venezuelan oil went to China via the shadow fleet, that would be counter to U.S. interests for two reasons. One, because the shadow fleet is a parallel structure, doesn't touch the U.S. financial system, intermediaries gain a lot, and China gets discounted crude oil compared to competitors like the United States. So there's a number of negatives from a America First strategy. I think, I do think that over time we will see oil flowing onto global markets. At the end of the day, the U.S. administration wants more oil. It wants cheaper oil. It's willing to prioritize global oil supplies over U.S. energy production. But that's a topic probably you've talked about on other podcasts. We don't need to get into that today. But it is a factor for the oil patch. So
what you're saying is that the America First, probably there is less reason to believe the China will continue to get the advantage. Though I'm just reading something which has come on my screen where there is a statement has come out that the US president has said that I have good relationship with Xi. China won't have the problem with the operation. They will get the oil. I think the big question is at what price? That's the key part. So all the Venezuelan oil will probably not go to US refineries because only Gulf Coast, some refineries are, and a lot of the US refineries have changed their slate to maximize the domestic processing. Is not the same US. US doesn't have the same demand for gasoline and other products as well. So probably the Venezuelan barrels, my view, Rachel, is will flow to the global markets once US starts to produce, US companies get in there and starts to produce at higher prices. But then that's where I also will say that general supply glut of 2026. What's your take on more oil to the market with Russia peace deal, more oil to the market, Venezuela peace deal, more oil with OPEC? What in this you don't believe will happen?
So You're right. It's an interesting point. For a long time in the Russia, after Russia's invasion, we had Russian oil in the market discounted, but the volumes had not gone down very much. And 2025 was a year when the volumes actually started to go down. This was first about Ukrainian drone attacks and reduction in refined fuel, and then the U.S. sanctions did have an effect. So this is the first time, you're right, if there is a peace deal that leads to sanctions relief on Russia, we would have more barrels. With Venezuela, I wrote a piece today or yesterday, I guess, where I thought about there's three phases, right? There's what happens, is the blockade that came into effect in the last month, is that reversed? If so, we could be talking about several 100,000, barrels a day coming back on the market that was being shut in. Then there is a medium-term story where you have an increase in production, maybe back to the levels where they were at the end of 2024. And then there is a more longer term story if, sort of US companies and other companies get back in and try to increase supply. Here you have a catch-22, right? Venezuela would not be selling at discounted prices to China, but the global price from which they're discounted might be lower. So in these price points, there's still money to be made. But in the glut scenario, just as drilling is slowing down in the United States, some of these oil companies might be slower to really scale up. And then there's the issue that power and water infrastructure and other things are constraints on scaling up production in Venezuela. So major increases in volume might be more of an issue for beyond 2026 rather than here. But ultimately, in the scenario where you have a lot more Russian and Venezuelan barrels, that creates an issue for OPEC Plus. We've already seen OPEC Plus say we're not going to add as much in Q1 and H1 of 2026. Maybe they end up scaling back a little bit there. But my hunch is in the short term, we would see a small amount of new oil coming, or we would see a return of oil to the market. And Trump, the U.S. government talked today about how Venezuela's role in the oil market will be completely different a year from now. It may be different. I'm not sure if we'll see the very sizable ramp up that's anticipated. The other factor at play here is one of debt politics. Right, Venezuela is a country that defaulted on its debt back almost 10 years ago now, right? And sanctions sort of froze that situation. But the debt investors will be waiting for a piece of the oil revenue. So there is a push to produce more, right? Because they think more oil means they can be paid more revenues. But at the end of the day, then maybe there would be less to go to the oil companies. So there's a lot of stuff to unpack and a lot of different interests between the lingering members of the Maduro regime who are still in power and members of the opposition who won the election last year, if all the data is and polling is correct. So I think this might be a little more complicated to actually get scaled up.
No, thank you, Rachel. I see, on Monday, probably there will not be a big market reaction. If Venezuelan oil was going to many countries, and if they lose the oil, then they have to buy the alternate because oil was already going to China, which had already bought to the maximum. Probably there will not be much impact, in my view, on the oil price of the market. Also, I think, as you pointed about the debt problems, it would not be easy to revive the oil industry in Venezuela because this is a very dirty, heavy crude we are talking about, and it needs huge amount of diluent to store. I did some numbers and I understood that you need about 30%, light Eagle Ford kind of a crude to be added to the Venezuelan Mere kind of barrels if you want to store in the SPRs. So 30% economics will not work. So I guess that for now, it is fair to say that probably on Monday, not a big market reaction because there was only one buyer. Longer term, the taps may not get turned on so quickly and so easily. And who knows, there is a lot to unpack, as you mentioned. This might get messy based on the people who are still in there, and this is just one individual who has been taken out of the country. So I think there's a lot of uncertainty. We cannot say anything for now.
Yeah, I think that's right. Now, I do think there might not be a big market reaction, but the trend would be towards weaker oil prices, right? Even if we're talking about a small amount of barrels coming on the market, we're also maybe seeing less global worries about will there be more losses from Russia. So the tendency would be towards weaker prices. Medium term, if there really are investments, then maybe that's the sort of direction of travel. The prospect of more supplies might cap the upside if there are other sort of supply risks. But ultimately, just as this ample and well-supplied market meant that oil prices did not rally sharply in the last few weeks when Venezuelan barrels came offline, I think it makes sense that if some of the risk premium comes out of the market, that the reverse would be true. Now, ultimately, though, I think we are dealing with a global economy where demand for oil products is shifting, as you said, and where, if anything, there's maybe more demand for fossil fuels that go into electricity and electricity sort of use. So I'm thinking about natural gas here and the like. So, it's important to watch. Could be quite important for energy companies that might want to book a lot more reserves. So maybe it plays out over time in oil equities, but that may be something for us to watch in the future.
Fantastic, Rachel. I'm going to ask you one more question, and depending upon in the editing, I'll place it somewhere.
Sure.
So this is about Russia, Rachel, which I want to ask, because of this, what happens next? Rachel, fantastic. Another angle I want to explore is there was a news that when the Russian crisis broke, Ukraine crisis, US actually went to Venezuela to get the oil so that tougher sanctions can be put on Russia. When they did not succeed to get a deal in the Biden administration, possibly, that's where they allowed and created the mechanism of price cap and encourage India to buy the oil. Otherwise, the oil prices would have gone skyrocketing, right? So Venezuela was approached to become sort of a key player to put tough sanctions on Russia. Now we have a different situation. Now we have a situation where Venezuelan oil, let's say, has already come into the US hands. What happens on Russia? Now you can put very tough sanctions on Russia without the worry of skyrocketing prices because you have Venezuela. Do you think that way?
I don't, because I just don't think that the volumes compute. Maybe in the medium term, if everything goes well, you could be looking at sizable volumes. But, if we think about 2022, right, we had a dynamic where, the Biden administration did do the tour. They went to every energy producer and said, can you pump more? What can you do? They went to a lot of companies and sort of said that. It was at that point where there was a little bit of a freeze for unfreeze deal with Iran at the time that led to gradually a little more Iranian oil coming into the global market, which really just went to China. You're noticing a theme here. But, and then later you did see a bit of creativity. The Biden administration told European companies, well, you can take some Venezuelan oil. They were easing the sanctions a little bit to pay back the debts. So there was a little bit there. But I think the scale of what Russia produces it just doesn't compare to where Venezuela is likely to be. It helps, but I don't think it's a game changer.
Okay, fantastic. Interesting developing story for sure. Thank you very much, Rachel, for covering this so quickly while you are in Philadelphia talking about the 2026 economy. For next time. Thank you.
Thank you.
XAnalysts. Empowering analysts, transforming markets.